The inflatable flamingo was still bobbing in the shallow end when the police sirens pierced the afternoon sun. Melanie, drenched in sweat and self-righteous fury, screamed, "She doesn't even live here." I stood barefoot on my patio with a pitcher of lemonade in one hand, looked the officer dead in the eye, and said, "Actually, I own the whole street, including her house." That's when Karen's jaw hit the pavement harder than her fake HOA rules ever did. It had started as a simple summer celebration, the kind with paper lanterns, folding chairs, and kids running in circles with melting popsicles. I had planned the pool party for a week. It wasn't some massive neighborhood rave. It was just friends, a few of my long-term tenants, and neighbors who knew how to mind their business. We had music, yes, but not loud enough to bother anyone unless they were looking for a reason to be bothered, which, of course, Karen always was. She had been a nuisance since the day she moved into 114 Cedar Ridge, a rental I owned. She strutted around like a rooster with a clipboard, sticking notices in mailboxes labeled "community violation" and inventing bylaws out of thin air. Never mind that there was no actual HOA on our street. Karen didn't need authority. She manufactured her own. That afternoon, she appeared at the edge of my lawn in her usual getup: sun visor, oversized sunglasses, and a flowery clipboard she clutched like a holy book. She marched up to the gate with the confidence of someone who thought being overbearing was a personality trait. "This is a disruption of the community peace," she declared, standing beside my rose bushes like she owned the place. I calmly took a sip of my lemonade. "Karen," I said, "we've been over this. There's no HOA here." I even offered her a cup of lemonade. She declined, eyes twitching at the sight of my guests enjoying themselves without her permission. She stomped back across the sidewalk, muttering something about laws and regulations. 5 minutes later, I heard her voice on the phone, rising like a tea kettle left too long on the burner. "Loud music," she shouted, "and possible underage drinking, unlicensed gathering, trespassing, emergency." I waved to my neighbor across the way, who gave me a sympathetic shrug. We both knew this wasn't the first time Karen had called the cops over a minor inconvenience. Last month, it had been a misplaced garden gnome. The month before, a barbecue she claimed was illegal because it was after 8:00 p.m. But this time, she made a miscalculation. The house she was targeting wasn't just my residence. It was the cornerstone of something bigger. The entire block had belonged to my grandfather, who built it brick by brick in the 70s. After he passed, I inherited it all quietly, without fanfare. I rented the homes at below-market rates to good families and kept a low profile. I didn't brag. I didn't flex, but I wasn't about to be bullied on my own land. When the patrol car pulled up, 2 officers stepped out with practiced neutrality. They walked toward the fence while Karen rushed ahead of them, gesturing wildly like she was directing traffic with her rage. "There she is," she hissed. "That's her. She's been disturbing the peace all afternoon. I pay taxes for protection. Do your job." The officer raised an eyebrow and turned to me. "Ma'am, do you live here?" I didn't flinch. I handed him my ID and smiled. "I do. In fact, I own this house, and that one, and that one, and the one she lives in too." I pointed down the street like a real estate agent at an open house. Karen's face froze. One of the officers blinked. "You own her house?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm her landlord." The silence that followed was delicious. Even the inflatable flamingo seemed to pause its lazy drift. The younger officer stifled a chuckle. The older one cleared his throat. "Well," he said, "I don't see anything unlawful happening here. Just a private gathering on private property. No noise complaints beyond this one." Karen looked like she had been slapped with a wet towel. She sputtered, That can't. This isn't how it works. She doesn't even respect the HOA. There is no HOA." I said kindly, "But thanks for your concern. You're welcome to join us if you want. We have peach cobbler." The officers walked back to their car, clearly done. Karen stood at the edge of the lawn, trembling with humiliation, fury, and confusion. I turned away before she could speak again. My guests had seen everything. They laughed quietly, trying not to make it worse, but I didn't mind. I wanted her to stew in it. What she didn't know, and what made the lemonade taste extra sweet that day, was that I had been keeping records, every false notice, every confrontation, every video from doorbell cameras. Her lease was up in less than a month, and I already had plans. She wasn't just a nuisance. She was a liability. And while I had tolerated her long enough, today she crossed the line. One of my tenants whispered, "You handled that like a queen." I just smiled. It wasn't about power. It was about peace. And Karen, she was a storm that needed to be cleared. As the music resumed and the grill sizzled, I sat back down in my chair and raised a toast to myself. Not because I had won, but because I finally decided it was time to stop playing small. Karen wanted to act like she owned the block. She was about to find out what happens when you mess with the person who actually does. After the police left and the laughter faded into the hum of summer cicadas, I found myself staring at Karen's house across the street, sipping what was left of my lemonade. The plastic flamingo floated lazily in the pool, still rocking slightly from the earlier chaos, as if mocking Karen's outburst. She had disappeared behind her curtains, but I knew better than to think this was over. Karen didn't retreat. She recalibrated. That night, long after the last guest left and the tiki torches burned out, I sat at my kitchen table with an old folder that had been growing thicker with each month. Inside were screenshots of emails, copies of fake HOA notices, pictures of trash cans she had moved out of spite, even a typed letter she once mailed to my tenant at 112 Cedar Ridge, accusing their teenage son of violating noise ordinances by playing acoustic guitar at dusk. He played Beatles covers. Gently, I had tolerated her nonsense for almost a year. At first, I gave her the benefit of the doubt, new to the neighborhood, maybe just overly eager to be involved, but that mask fell quickly. She started walking around with a clipboard, issuing citations like a sheriff in a silent western. The HOA letters were the most absurd, official-looking, with made-up rule numbers and threats of fines. I cross-checked everyone against the actual zoning laws. They were fantasy, but she handed them out like candy. One elderly couple got a warning for having garden gnomes in the front yard. Another family was told their kids couldn't sell lemonade without a permit for lemonade. And not just any permit, an HOA business permit in a neighborhood with no HOA. I had never seen someone cling so tightly to imaginary power. But what Karen lacked in actual authority, she made up for with volume, persistence, and a disturbing sense of purpose. It wasn't about safety or peace. It was about control, the illusion of importance. And until now, no one had challenged her head-on. I flipped through the lease agreements, stopping at hers. Signed last summer, 12-month term, no renewal clause. I had intentionally kept it flexible. I had a feeling she might be a problem. The lease would expire in 26 days. It was time to stop letting her believe this block belonged to her clipboard. The next morning, I took a walk down the street. It wasn't just about her anymore. I needed to see the damage. I passed 116 Cedar, where a new tenant had just moved in. They waved. I waved back. No notices on their door. That was a good sign. Then 118, where Mrs. Calloway had told me Karen once tried to fine her for hanging wind chimes. Too reflective, Karen had claimed, could distract passing drivers. The chimes barely moved in the breeze. Mrs. Calloway's little ceramic duck collection was untouched on the porch. Progress. At 120, the Jenkins family greeted me from their driveway. They looked relaxed. Mr. Jenkins asked if I'd seen the new signs Karen had posted. I stopped. Signs? He pointed down the street. Sure enough, tacked onto several telephone poles were laminated sheets titled Neighborhood Enforcement Zones. Underneath were lists of prohibited activities like amplified music, water play, unregistered gatherings, and unauthorized decorations. One sign even had a warning about fireworks, complete with clip art of firecracker in a red circle. It read, "Violators will be reported to HOA leadership and fined accordingly." I almost laughed. HOA leadership. That would be Karen's cat, I assumed. Back at home, I printed out a fresh notice of lease expiration. I wasn't one for drama, but I also wasn't going to let her claim ignorance when the time came. I slid it into an envelope with a polite cover letter. Dear Miss Langford, this is formal notice that your lease will not be renewed upon its expiration on the 31st of this month. You are expected to vacate the premises by that date. Thank you. I delivered it myself, walking across the street with steady feet. I knocked. Karen opened the door with narrowed eyes. She was in her bathrobe, hair in curlers, mug in hand that said, Boss Lady. I handed her the envelope without a word. She took it, opened it, read it, then looked up. You're evicting me. I corrected her calmly. I'm choosing not to renew your lease. It's a business decision. She stared at me, her jaw working overtime to process the blow. This isn't fair, she said. I've done so much for this neighborhood. You've created tension where there was peace, I replied. That's not the kind of presence I support as a landlord. She slammed the door in my face. I walked back slowly, feeling more relief than satisfaction. It wasn't about punishment. It was about protection for everyone else on the block. Later that evening, a knock at my door startled me. I opened it to find the tenants from next door, a young couple who had moved in 3 months ago. They looked nervous. Sorry to bother you, the man said. We just wanted to say thanks for handling that today. We didn't know you owned everything. We thought she was the one in charge. I smiled. You're not the first ones to think that, but things are going to change now. The woman looked down the street. She gave us a letter last week saying our porch plants were unauthorized. I took a deep breath. Keep the plants. In fact, add more. They laughed. We stood there for a while, the three of us watching the last of the sun dip behind the rooftops. It felt like something had shifted, like a weight was finally being lifted from the street. I knew Karen wasn't done yet. She would find a way to escalate. That was her nature. But now I was ready, not just with paperwork and property rights, with clarity, with resolve, and with the knowledge that when you own the land someone else is trying to rule, you don't fight back with noise. You just wait, and when the lease ends, so does the tyranny. I looked down at my hand, still holding the folder of complaints. I folded it shut and placed it on the counter. I wouldn't need it much longer. The countdown had already begun. The next letter I received from Karen arrived not in an envelope, but taped to my front gate with clear packing tape and highlighted in yellow marker. It was printed on thick, glossy paper with a fake emblem that looked suspiciously like the recycling symbol, but with the words Neighborhood Code Authority around it in bold. At the top, in capital letters, was the heading, HOA Violation Citation. According to Karen's letter, I had violated community standards on multiple counts, including excessive aquatic gatherings, non-permitted decorations, public disturbance via amplified sound, and visual pollution caused by inflatable animals. I read it twice just to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. Then I turned it over to see if there was a punchline. There wasn't. That same afternoon, I found similar notices on my tenants' doors. One had been cited for a front yard hammock, another for having a non-uniform mailbox. It was a standard black box, identical to mine. Even the Jenkins kids got one for sidewalk chalk drawings Karen had labeled as unapproved public art. She had escalated, and she was doubling down on the idea that an HOA existed and that she somehow was its president, enforcer, and judge. I walked down the block, collecting the notices, tenants watching from their windows like villagers under siege. I didn't want to feed her drama with more drama, but it was clear she was planning something bigger. I could feel it in the air. Karen was getting desperate, and desperate Karens do not retreat quietly. A few days later, the flyers appeared, neon yellow with bold red lettering. They were stapled to light poles, mailboxes, and even taped to a stop sign. Community HOA meeting, they said, mandatory attendance. Topics included enforcement policy, community expectations, and consequences for non-compliance. It was scheduled for Saturday morning at the dead end of our cul-de-sac. Karen's flyer ended with the words, snacks provided, and dress code, respectful. I had to read that one twice, too. I had a decision to make. I could ignore it and let her fizzle out on her own, or I could attend and dismantle her entire fantasy publicly. I chose the second option. Saturday morning, I showed up with a clipboard of my own and a small camp chair. I wore sunglasses, a plain t-shirt, and the calm expression of someone who was both amused and ready for battle. A few of my tenants and neighbors came too, mostly out of curiosity. Karen had even roped in her cousin from 2 blocks away, who arrived with a coffee pot and paper cups like he was working an office break room. Karen stood at the front of the cul-de-sac, behind a folding table covered in printed rule books she had clearly made herself. There were plastic bins labeled Fine ES and a PEALs, and one manila envelope marked complaints. She welcomed everyone with a strange smile and began reading from a printed script. She opened with a greeting from the HOA board, which did not exist, and proceeded to outline a list of expectations for the community. At one point, she announced that a newly proposed rule would limit the number of parties held per household to 1 per season, and declared that noise should not exceed 65 decibels at any point after 4:00 p.m. Someone asked how that would be measured. She held up a decibel app on her phone and nodded with all the confidence of a certified technician. Another person asked if there was a legal basis for her rules. She said the neighborhood had entered an informal HOA covenant by virtue of being here. That's when I raised my hand. Karen paused. She looked at me like she'd swallowed a lemon whole. Yes, she said, forcing her voice to stay level. I stood. Thank you. I just want to clarify for the group that there is no HOA here. This street and all the homes on it are privately owned. Most of them by me, the rest by individuals who never agreed to any covenant or board. Karen stammered, Actually, the community has a right to self-regulate. We have collective interest rights under local ordinances. No, I said calmly, we don't. I've checked with the city zoning board. There's no record of any HOA filings or association status for this area. What we have is a self-appointed authority figure attempting to enforce personal preferences under the guise of regulation. That's not only misleading, it's borderline harassment. The crowd murmured. Her cousin suddenly found a reason to check his phone. Karen's face flushed pink and then red. You can't just dismiss community spirit because it doesn't suit you. Community spirit doesn't require fines, fake letters, or threats, I said. It requires trust, cooperation, respect, and what you've been doing, Karen, isn't leadership. It's control. She opened her mouth again, but I cut her off. I held up a folder with copies of her printed notices, timestamps from security camera footage, and signed statements from tenants. I've documented everything, and just so you know, I've sent a summary to the city mediator's office. If this continues, it will become a legal matter. Karen snapped, Are you threatening me? No, I'm informing you. This isn't a power struggle. It's a property line, and you've crossed it. The silence that followed was heavy. Nobody clapped. Nobody spoke. People simply got up from their chairs, picked up their things, and slowly walked away. Her cousin folded the coffee table. One of the teenagers grabbed a snack and left. Karen stood behind her folding table, gripping the edge like it was the last piece of land she had left to defend. I turned and walked back to my house without another word. I wasn't angry. I wasn't gloating. I just felt tired. Tired of having to stand guard over peace. But the weight I carried for months began to lift. People saw the truth now. The spell had been broken. Later that day, I got texts from neighbors. Thank you. We're with you. One of them even dropped off a small cactus with a card that said, in case she tries to redecorate. I placed it by my front window and laughed for the first time in a while. That night, I sat by the pool, the water still and glowing under string lights. I thought about how absurd it had all become, how one woman with no title and no backing managed to create so much tension out of thin air. But the bigger surprise was how easily it crumbled once confronted with fact, with ownership, and with quiet resolve. She wanted control, but I had the deeds, and soon I would have her keys. I woke up to the sound of hammering and the sharp whine of an electric drill. It was barely 8:00 in the morning. At first, I thought it was coming from a few houses down, where a tenant had mentioned repairing their deck. But as I stepped outside with my coffee, I saw it. Karen had built a fence, not just any fence. a gleaming white plastic monstrosity that stretched across the property line, cutting through the shared space between her rental and the neighbor's driveway. It looked like it had been assembled in a panic, with jagged angles and crooked panels. She stood proudly behind it, arms crossed, supervising the two handymen who were still attaching latches to the gate. The fence wasn't just ugly, it was illegal. It crossed into common easements, blocked a portion of the sidewalk, and worse, the far end curved awkwardly into the street like a fence built in a video game glitch. I stared at it for a moment, trying to decide whether to laugh or scream. Instead, I called my attorney. He picked up after 2 rings, and I didn't even say hello. I just said, "She built a fence." He sighed. "Let me guess. No permit, no survey, no approval." "I don't even think it's on her own property." "That's a zoning violation. Send me pictures." I hung up and snapped half a dozen photos, including one of Karen smiling smugly as she watered her plants next to the freshly planted post. When she noticed me, she waved like a politician on parade. I waved back, but with my phone still up. She frowned. That afternoon, I drafted a formal notice from my attorney's office. It was short, direct, and clear. Remove the unauthorized fence within 5 business days or face legal action for trespass and code violations. I walked it across the street and slipped it through her mailbox. I didn't knock. I didn't want another confrontation, but I knew she would read it, and I knew she would retaliate. She did, but not with more plastic or flyers. This time, she used cameras. 2 days later, I spotted them mounted on the corners of her roof. Small black domes that slowly rotated like lazy eyeballs. One pointed directly at my yard, another at the driveway of the Jenkins family. I checked with the other neighbors. Same thing. She had installed surveillance equipment and positioned it to cover areas well beyond her own property. No signs, no warnings, just quiet, creeping invasion. The neighborhood group chat exploded. People were livid. One neighbor claimed she saw Karen writing down license plates of visiting cars. Another said she tried to ask about the cameras, and Karen responded by citing something called Subsection 9 of the Community Monitoring Policy, which again did not exist. I wanted to do something dramatic. I wanted to climb onto her roof and paint the cameras with barbecue sauce. But I knew better. What Karen craved was a scene. I wasn't going to give it to her. I'd already given her too much. So I took another route. The drone had been a gift from my nephew, who was a videographer. He used it to film weddings and landscapes. I asked if I could borrow it just for a day. He dropped it off with a full charge and a mischievous grin. I programmed it to follow a simple path around the block and activated the speaker. As the drone lifted into the sky, I watched it from the patio, lemonade in hand. It hovered above my property first, then slowly passed over the neighborhood, dipping just low enough to make its presence known but not violate any height restrictions. The speaker played a familiar sound, Karen's voice, specifically, a clip from her 911 call during my pool party. Loud music, unlicensed gathering, disturbance of peace. It repeated every few minutes. People came out of their homes, laughing. One neighbor saluted the drone. Kids chased it on bikes. Karen stepped onto her porch, holding a broom like a medieval weapon. She shouted at the drone, waving the broom in the air, then launched it skyward with an awkward swing. She missed, of course, and the broom hit her fence instead, knocking one of the panels loose. The drone captured it all. I didn't post the footage online, but someone else did. Within hours, it made its way to a local meme page with the title, "Neighborhood Watcher Loses It Over Splay Balloon." Karen's embarrassment multiplied when the video hit 5,000 views in a day. People in the comments offered to buy her decibel meter. Others asked if she gave Hawaii tours. She didn't come outside much after that. For a brief moment, there was peace, but it wasn't over. A few days later, she dropped another surprise. This time, it was a full event flyer. Colorful, glittery, laminated, taped to every door. HOA gala and recognition ceremony. Formal dress required. Saturday evening. It listed made-up awards like Best Lawn Maintenance and Most Compliant Resident. The kicker was the location, her backyard, which was technically my backyard. She had no right to host events there. The lease agreement clearly prohibited large gatherings without landlord approval, but approval had never mattered to Karen. I didn't react immediately. I waited until Saturday afternoon. Then, as the decorations were going up and chairs were being arranged, I arrived with 2 movers, a clipboard, and a file folder. Karen was mid-speech rehearsal when she saw me. She wore a gold shawl and a plastic crown. It would have been comical if it weren't so absurd. I handed her a printed notice of non-renewal, along with a summary of the violations she had accumulated. I also included a formal warning that any event held on my property without consent would result in immediate eviction. She looked at the papers, then at the guests arriving in heels and ties. "You're trying to humiliate me." "No," I said. "I'm trying to restore sanity to the neighborhood." She opened her mouth to argue, but one of the chairs tipped over and knocked a folding table into the fence, which collapsed completely on the side she had patched together. A silence fell over the yard. Someone whispered, "Is this still the gala?" I walked away before she could say anything else. I didn't look back. That night, the lights were taken down. The guests left early. The glitter signs wilted in the dew. The next morning, a for rent sign was quietly placed in the lawn of 114 Cedar Ridge. Karen hadn't put it there. I had. Her final weeks were numbered, and now, so were her illusions. The house stood quieter than usual. The plastic fence had been removed, the camera domes unplugged, and the glitter-covered gala signs stripped from every surface. Karen's once dominant presence on the block had thinned out like morning fog. Her movements became furtive. Curtains stayed drawn. There were no new flyers, no new laminated threats, no sidewalk lectures about neighborhood conduct. She had become a ghost in her own theater, but I knew better than to think silence meant surrender. Karen didn't stop, she schemed. 14 days remained on her lease. I knew she wouldn't leave without a final attempt at reclaiming control. That attempt came in the form of a moving truck, or rather, the illusion of one. It arrived one morning and parked dramatically in front of her house, blocking 2 driveways. The men who stepped out were not movers but friends of hers from some community group she belonged to. She ordered them around in a voice loud enough for neighbors to hear. Phrases like, "We need this property free of harassment," and "I'm being forced out by abusive landlords," rang out for anyone within half a block. She wasn't just packing, she was staging. The next day, I received a certified letter from a legal office I had never heard of. The letter accused me of retaliatory eviction, mental distress, and discrimination against community leadership. It was 3 pages long, filled with dramatic phrases and no actual citations of law. My attorney read it and sighed so hard I thought he might deflate. He told me it was a scare tactic, nothing more. The lease was legal. The documentation was airtight. Still, Karen was trying to twist her exit into a spectacle of victimhood. That same week, a new development caught my attention. A listing appeared online, a house for rent, right here on our block. The photos looked oddly familiar. I clicked through them and realized she had listed the house she was being evicted from. My house, the one she no longer had any right to rent out. She had posted it under a fake management company and added a paragraph about being available for immediate move-in, ideal for peace-loving tenants. I printed the listing and brought it straight to my attorney, who filed a cease and desist within the hour. The response was swift. She pulled the listing down that night, but not before several people had driven by, confused about whether the house was available. One family even knocked on my door to ask about viewing the property. I explained the situation politely and gave them my real contact number in case they were still interested after Karen moved out. They looked relieved. One of them muttered, "We thought something was weird when she said the rent would be paid in cash and that HOA approval was required for kids' toys." 10 days remained. Karen's cousin reappeared. He brought boxes and helped her carry out decorative lawn ornaments shaped like lighthouses and cherubs. The rest of the neighborhood watched cautiously. Some tenants asked me if I thought she'd actually leave. I said yes, because now she didn't have a choice. That Friday, I received another surprise. Karen had sent out formal invitations again, this time for a goodbye party. The envelope was pink. Inside, a card printed with swirly font invited the entire neighborhood to a send-off gala in her honor, with refreshments and a champagne toast. The phrase community legend appeared twice. I almost laughed, but it also made me uneasy. Karen didn't throw farewell parties out of sentiment. She threw them for show, for control, for one last chance to flip the narrative. I didn't respond. I didn't attend. But I made sure to have someone else there. A plain-clothed paralegal from my attorney's office attended quietly as a guest. He took notes. He also brought a document tucked neatly in a folder, just in case Karen decided to announce a permanent stay or hand out fake subleases mid-toast. Saturday arrived with more decorations, balloons tied to her mailbox, a table of cupcakes, a Bluetooth speaker playing nostalgic pop songs. About 15 people showed up, most of them from her personal circle. Some neighbors stopped by out of politeness. Others stayed behind curtains. Karen stood near the porch, greeting people with forced brightness. She wore a white dress and a sash that said neighborhood chairperson. When she raised a glass of sparkling cider and began her speech, I listened from my yard. She spoke of community efforts, of vision, of the work still unfinished. She mentioned struggles, misunderstandings, unfair treatment. Then she paused for effect. Her eyes scanned the street, and though my name was never mentioned, her gaze lingered on my home long enough to make the message clear. I did not interrupt. I let her have her moment, her goodbye. It didn't matter. Everything she said was for her own benefit, not ours. The street didn't need her leadership. It needed relief. The next morning was the deadline. A gray sky hung over the block, the kind of weather that felt like an exhale. A moving truck actually did arrive this time. Real movers. They packed boxes with the quiet speed of people who had done this 100 times. Karen gave orders without her usual flair. No clipboard, no costume, no crown. By late afternoon, the last chair was loaded. She stood by the truck a moment, looking at the porch, the fence line, the street. She didn't wave. She didn't say goodbye. She just got in the passenger seat and drove off. I waited until the sun began to set before I crossed the street. I walked through the empty yard and stood on the porch. I unlocked the door with the set of keys she had left in the mailbox. The house smelled faintly of air freshener and lavender cleaner. She hadn't trashed it. She hadn't vandalized or left angry notes. That surprised me. Maybe part of her knew it was over, that she had lost the one thing she had been clinging to. I walked back home, a strange calm settling over me. Not joy, not victory, just quiet. The kind of quiet that had been missing from the block for almost a year. The next day, I put up a small wooden sign in the front yard of her former house. It said, "Now leasing," but beneath it, in smaller letters, it said, "Calm tenants only." Several people noticed and laughed. Karen had called 911 on me for having a pool party. She had tried to enforce fake rules, host fake meetings, create fake authority, and now all she had was an empty house in her rearview mirror and me, standing where she thought she reigned, holding the keys to everything she never truly owned. The house sat quietly for 3 days after Karen left. No sounds, no papers taped to doorways, no security cameras blinking in the corners. The yard, once cluttered with plastic decor and caution signs about non-existent neighborhood rules, looked bare in the best way. The street felt lighter. People lingered in their driveways again. Neighbors waved without glancing over their shoulders. One man even put a hammock between 2 trees in his yard, as if celebrating a silent victory. The block was breathing again. On the 4th day, a new family pulled up to tour the house. A couple in their 30s with 2 small kids. The children ran through the empty yard, giggling, chasing each other around the mailbox. The mother smiled and asked if they could see inside. I unlocked the door, letting them walk through at their own pace. There were no strange smells, no leftover signs of power games, just a quiet house with clean floors, neutral walls, and sunlight filtering through the kitchen window. As they left, the husband said, "This place feels peaceful." I nodded and told him the whole street was changing. He didn't ask why. He just smiled and said, "It's hard to find a place that feels like that anymore." They applied later that evening. I approved them the next morning. Word spread fast that Karen was gone, that she hadn't just moved out, but left for good. Some neighbors thought she might reappear with a lawsuit or another flyer taped to a tree. Others joked that she would return disguised with a wig, pretending to be her own cousin to claim residency. But none of that happened. Her social media went silent. No HOA alerts, no weekly updates, no farewell manifesto. She vanished like a badly written chapter in a story that finally turned the page. To mark the moment, I decided to host another pool party. Nothing big, just a few neighbors, some snacks, music set to a normal volume, and an inflatable flamingo that had somehow survived the chaos of the previous summer. People brought folding chairs, lawn games, and lemonade. Someone baked a cake shaped like a stop sign. Another brought a piñata that looked suspiciously like a clipboard. One of the new tenants asked if it was okay to set up a small speaker. I laughed and said, "As long as it doesn't play fake bylaws, it's welcome." The pool reflected the sky as kids splashed and adults relaxed. No tension in the air, no clipboard lurking near the bushes. Halfway through the afternoon, I made a small speech. I stood near the patio, holding my cup of lemonade. I didn't prepare anything. I just spoke from where I stood. I said that neighborhoods should be built on respect, not control. That community doesn't come from printed warnings or phony power, but from looking out for one another. I told them that what we had gone through wasn't just about a difficult tenant. It was a reminder that silence in the face of nonsense can sometimes do more harm than good, that sometimes standing up quietly is louder than shouting back. People nodded, some clapped, others raised their drinks. Then the music played again, and just like that, the moment passed into something light and warm. We weren't celebrating Karen's departure. We were celebrating something deeper. The return of peace, of balance, of a neighborhood no longer living under self-appointed authority. Later that night, after the party had ended and the sky turned orange with sunset, I sat by the pool alone. The flamingo bobbed gently. The surface of the water rippled with a breeze. From across the street, I saw one of the new tenants watering her plants. She waved. I waved back. No tension, no sideways glances, just people living side by side without the weight of drama or suspicion. I thought back to the first moment Karen had stepped into my life. The flyers, the made-up rules, the fake citations, all of it now seemed like something from a strange movie, one I never asked to star in. And yet here I was, having lived through it, come out the other side, and finally reclaimed the quiet I had built this neighborhood to have. In a small corner of my living room, I kept a box. Inside it were all the notices she had printed, the photos of the fence, a copy of the gala invitation, and the laminated rule sheet that banned inflatable animals. I didn't keep it out of spite. I kept it because one day I'd want to remind myself how absurd things can get when people try to control what they don't understand. The next morning, I planted a new sign near the entrance of the cul-de-sac. It was carved wood, not plastic. A simple message painted in soft letters. Private community. Respect and courtesy. Peace required. Underneath it, I left a small flower bed with marigolds and lavender. Within hours, someone added wind chimes. Then a bench appeared. Then someone brought a little library box and filled it with books. There was no HOA. There never had been. But now there was something stronger. A sense of shared understanding, of earned calm. Of neighborhood not as a title but as a feeling. As summer wore on, the block bloomed with small changes. Porch swings were installed. Sidewalk chalk reappeared. The same hammock Karen had once tried to ban was now surrounded by fairy lights. People started stopping to talk again. Pets were walked without whispered warnings about leash length or property lines. One evening, I received a handwritten note in my mailbox. No return name, just simple handwriting on paper. It said, "Thank you for standing your ground when the rest of us were tired. Because of you, we remembered how to be neighbors." I folded it and placed it in the box beside the other remnants, not as part of the chaos, but as its closing line. Peace, once broken, is hard to restore, but when it returns, even quietly, it feels louder than any noise that came before. And for the first time in months, I realized I didn't just own the block. I belonged to it.